Okay, welcome everyone. As Anya mentioned, my name is Eleanor and I'm the other co-director of Summer School. Before I hand over to our university president to formally welcome the delegates today, I know many of you who have attended previous summer schools probably remember our dear friend and colleague Gabor Gombos, who actually passed away earlier this month. So I just wanted to reflect briefly on Gabor's legacy, and in a moment I'll be inviting you to share with me a minute's silence in his memory. So Gabor, as many of you know, was an honorary professor here at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy. He was such a generous colleague and a great mentor to many of our students. If you've been at previous summer schools, you probably encountered Gabor. He was certainly a firm favourite on the lineup, especially when it came to his fascinating insights on the topic of legal capacity. In a previous life, Gabor was a physicist, so he actually really understood what a paradigm shift scientifically meant, and he was best placed to show us how the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really achieved that aim. We owe Gabor a great debt. Without his work and the work of others in the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, we would not have Article 12 of the UN Convention. When Gabor was a member of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities representing Hungary, he paved the way for what became General Comment 1, and that was a real game changer for legal capacity reform around the world. It's in part for this work that he did that we honoured Gabor in 2018 here in Galway with the Global Disability Activism Award, which we presented to him at that year's summer school. And we named that award in memory of another titan of the global disability rights movement, our own Martin Naughton. The last project I worked on with Gabor was the Voices Project, where he and his great friend and co-conspirator Amita Danda from India performed a real tour de force, powerfully demonstrating their skill at weaving storytelling through arguments for legal change. So I'd invite you now to honour his memory with me by observing a minute's silence in his name. Thank you all. Gabor, we honour you, we remember you, we miss you. We go forward through this week and beyond, and we try to live up to the example that you set us, always striving, calm and determined, pursuing transformative justice for all. So with that, I'll invite our university president, Ciarán Ó Thuchtaigh, and the chair of this morning's first panel to welcome you formally to this year's summer school. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thank you very much, and you're all very welcome. I'm very pleased to be here. I think this is a very good facility, so I hope it works with my soft T's and accent. So, and thank you to the interpreter as well. It's very important for us that everybody can get access to what is said today. My name is Ciarán Ó Thuchtaigh. I'd be interested to see how the text picks up on that, but I'm president of the university. This is my alma mater, so I'm a commerce graduate from NUI Galway back in the late 1980s. And when I was a student here, even when I was a teenager in Galway, I lived just across the road, Myola Park in Newcastle. I would, when I was going to town, come through the university. And since I came here, it's really important to me that everybody can do the same. Because when I was a teenager growing up in Galway, or a student, I felt this was my place. And I'd like, since I came here, everybody to feel the same. And I've been very pleased every year that I can to come to open the disability summer school and the public policy area in this space, because it's particularly important for us in NUI Galway for a number of reasons. Primarily because it really fits with the values of the university. As you may know, and colleagues will certainly know, because I talk about this a lot, and I think we need to keep talking about our values. We, as a part of our strategy of NUI Galway, in which we launched in late 2019, 2020, just before COVID, set about a number of values. To me, it was very important to have a values-based strategy. So not saying what we would do, or that we would build buildings, or have this program or that program, but how we would be. Because we are, after all, not human doings, but human beings. And it's really important for us as a university to define how we would be with each other, with ourselves, with the communities which we serve. And therefore we settled on a number of values, the most important of which was respect. So at the time, the President of the Congress of Trade Unions in Ireland, a woman called Patricia King, was on our advisory board for the strategy. And she said, if you only have one word in the university, one word in your strategy, and that word is respect, that all else follows. And I think particularly in the context of today, I note the respect that's here. This building itself is a very open building, very accessible. Remembering Gabor, I think, is particularly important in respecting the traditions, the activism of others. But also I noticed, and I think particularly important for me, the context of the context in which we're in, the request for me, for example, to have an antigen test, to wear a mask. I think very often the rest of society has forgotten that we still have COVID amongst us, and that for some members of our society, that's particularly a particular vulnerability. So all of what I think is about today, the respect in which this summer school is organised, I commend you for it, because I think it's particularly important, as I say, that this is a university that has respect for all the talents. And that's the second thing. The second value we had was the value of openness. Again, somewhat like that sense that I had that this was an open place for me when I was growing up. I'd like this university to be open to all the talents. And again, we're thinking in our planning for the campus that we would knock down walls. There are lots of walls still around the university, that we would make things much more accessible than they are right now. We still have some way to go. But part of that is the philosophy that this university is open to others to come in, to debate, to argue, to dissent, to challenge us, to be activists. And I think particularly I'm keen that our students continue to be activists, not only for themselves, but for others in broader society. And again, this summer school is a very important part of that philosophy, that this university is open to you, but also open to different ideas, different perspectives, and open to challenge. Particularly important that challenging what needs to be done. Very often it shouldn't be challenged, but still, unfortunately, we still need to have that sense of activism that certainly is in this room. The third value we had was a value of excellence. And again, this is here, the academic excellence of the summer school, the basis on which discussions take place. But also, I think very important, again, that sense I have learned during my time here, this, what we call, or what you would call also, I think, expertise by experience. That excellence is not defined as a difficult thing or something outside ourselves. Excellence, we can define ourselves as well by the challenges we meet and the experience we have, and that the case study of one is particularly important, that the challenge, the experience that one person has can also define the rest of the university. So excellence, I think, is again here today, the academic discussion, but also in the experience you bring. And I hope that you bring all of your experience as experts in your area, experts in your life to the summer school as well. And then the final value we had was sustainability. Students particularly keen on having that value of sustainability. And that generally means environmental sustainability, very, very important, as we know. But I also think it also means sustaining each other as a community, sustaining each other through the journey of life, sustaining traditions of academic excellence and rigor. And again, the summer school does that as well. So it sustains the next generation of research and teaching and engagement in this area. And I think, again, that's particularly important for us. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to the summer school once more, the 13th. We have, I think, 35, 36 countries here, so it is very much an international summer school. You bring with you all your own experience, your own expertise on the world. And particularly important, we also said, raising it up above our values, why we are here, is as a university, we are here, first of all, for the public good. And sometimes that should go without saying. Universities should all be for the public good, but sometimes we're not. We don't say it enough. And what that means is we therefore don't serve ourselves. We serve the public good. We serve you as our students. We serve society more generally, and we serve our planet in the context of the broader challenges that we have. So again, the summer school is very much in line with that. And I'm very grateful to all the organisers today. I wish I had a purple t-shirt. They look, I'd like to join in if you like, but I think all the organisers, thank you very much. As was mentioned, largely volunteers, people who do this because it's of interest and it's important to us. And I'd like to thank you all for that. I won't speak, normally I say something in Irish, Oscueiliga, but it would be, I guess, difficult for the interpreter and for the script. So I just say Guramahagiv, thank you in Irish, and thank you all very much. Thank you. Normally when I come to events like this, I have I'm like a butterfly. I come, I open it, and then I go again. But thankfully today, I'm delighted that I'm able to stay for the first session and chairing the first session. And we have 3 speakers. We have one recorded, one in person, thankfully, and then one online. So we'll have 2 speakers before the coffee break, and we might have Q&A before then if we get the chance, and then 1 speaker after, and then questions and answers after the coffee break. Coffee break about 11:15 or so. So the first speaker I think we've lined up is Yolanda Munoz from the University of McGill University in Canada, and she is joining us. Thankfully, she's not up that early in the morning to present from Canada. She's provided us with the recording of her talk, and you came to listen to her and to others this morning, not to me. So I'll just sit down now and give the floor to Yolanda. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Yolanda Munoz, and I am a guest in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, in the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, who are the ancestral custodians of the lands where I live today. I am honored to be with you this day to discuss the challenges and opportunities regarding the creation of strategic partnerships between the disability rights movement and the climate action and environmental justice promoters. First, I would like to share with you my experience as a consultant for the Global Green Grants Fund in their quest to incorporate disability in their grant-making portfolio. In 2018, the Global Green Grants Fund received support from the Ford Foundation to include disability in their activities. At that moment, the Global Green Grants Fund had very little experience with organizations of persons with disabilities, but they were enthusiastic and receptive. Most of all, they wanted to be coherent with their ideal of social justice for everyone. They hired 3 persons with experience in inclusive and anti-ableist grant-making, and I was one of them. We had the opportunity to offer an in-person training on ableism to the coordinators who contact and recommend organizations worldwide to receive a grant. At that point, some persons in Honduras had already been working with the Miskito divers, who had acquired a disability as a result of poor working conditions in the extraction of lobsters in the Atlantic Ocean. The Miskito divers and their families were left to fend for themselves as their employers and the government did not acknowledge accountability for the divers' rights, both as former employees and now as persons with disabilities. Some wives and widows also participated in these activities, promoting the diversification of the sources of income for these isolated indigenous communities, as well as safe conditions for the divers and a just compensation for the irreparable loss of their loved ones. In other regions, the first challenge for the coordinators was to find organizations of persons with disabilities in remote rural areas where most of them work. Well, and as you know, grassroots organizations of persons with disabilities work under very precarious conditions in those areas with very limited budget, and oftentimes their headquarters are one of the members' home. And well, with some research and the support of allies, they managed to get in touch with local organizations of persons with disabilities, or OPDs, to explain them the objectives of the fund and offer them a grant, but they met an unexpected response. Several organizations did not want to engage in the topic. The main reason was that, quite frankly, they did not have any knowledge on the relationship between their priorities and climate change and environmental justice. We, as a team, interpreted this as a result of years of exclusion characterized by inaccessible information and systemic denial of disability as a key component of the climate action efforts. Some of them had knowledge on their right to be included in emergency responses when natural disasters, war, or other tragedies hit the population, as stated in Article 11 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, most of these OPDs did not have information about the right to be included in emergency preparedness. And also they didn't know anything about the influence of systemic ableism and their chances to cope with the effects of erratic weather behavior and environmental degradation. The lack of knowledge made both parts, environmental justice promoters and organizations of persons with disabilities, they made them realize that it was urgent to delve more into concrete examples of the relationship between ableism and environmental justice. The learning curve started by explaining what environmental justice and climate action are, and at that moment, that relationship was those definitions were not clear to organizations of persons with disabilities. This despite the fact that most of these organizations are based in countries and regions where the effects of environmental degradation and climate change are particularly violent, such as droughts, severe floods, forced displacement, deforestation, and the effects of extractive industries, among others. So together, they reflected on how poverty and discrimination affected the chances of survival of persons with disabilities when human-made and natural catastrophes affect the community. The main question was how persons with disabilities can become part of the solution to ensure that everyone will enjoy the right to a healthy environment. In this way, the Global Green Grants Fund and their partners became pioneers in the production of solutions and knowledge to implement responses to environmental degradation and climate action in very adverse contexts, including the important digital divide and language barriers that prevent them from having access to critical information to build solid projects and advocacy strategies. At the same time, environmental justice promoters were learning more about the concept of ableism, the content of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, how the Sustainable Development Goals included them in regard to climate action, and how they could work with organizations to propose meaningful projects to build bridges between the two movements. These environmental justice defenders were convinced that they would be better equipped for inclusion if they actually recruited members with disabilities who could share their own expertise to ensure, for example, that the information was easy to understand for everyone, or that the needs of persons with disabilities were not considered quote unquote optional, but an integral part of their strategies. These organizations stopped thinking of disability as a tragic result of pollution, for example. Now they were understanding that regardless of the causes of the impairment, persons with disabilities were agents of social change. During this first stage, then, most of the projects aimed to build the capacity of the organizations to understand these concepts and how they were related to disability rights. In every case, the point of departure was the same. Persons with disabilities are not passive recipients of help, but active members of the community who wish to contribute to putting an end to environmental degradation and be part of the decision-making processes regarding the design of plans and strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change. Some projects also included an intersectional lens around gender, the belonging to an indigenous community, and age. Several projects also address the inequalities of the deaf community, who are frequently excluded from the right to expressing their opinion in decision-making processes. Besides capacity building, some projects addressed internal displacement due to environmental degradation, while some others proposed actions like reforestation and organic agriculture. Gradually, some groups developed advocacy activities to ensure that the local and regional authorities took into consideration the opinions and knowledge of persons with disabilities. This was the case of the Zimbabwe Sunshine Group, which started with a project of capacity building where people with hearing disabilities and speech impairments participated in a series of performances where the whole community got access to information in their own language. Later, the same organization received a new grant to create a disability rights young leaders platform to equip young leaders with knowledge on climate change, disability rights, and activism, empowering them to become agents of change. This group launched the petition Not Without Us, which they submitted to the Environmental Management Agency and the Department of Climate Change. The organization also established an environmental justice and disability rights information sharing system through a platform for young people living with disabilities. But then the pandemic hit, and it had a tremendous impact in the implementation of projects that the Global Green Grants Fund was supporting. There were important restrictions for gathering and traveling, but lack of access to the internet meant complete isolation for many people with disabilities worldwide. The organizations also became aware of the important obstacles that the pandemic imposed on persons with disabilities. And they used this experience to examine from this specific perspective the social inequalities that they were facing. For example, a group of deaf young persons in Cameroon heavily relied on their families to get information about what was happening and why they must stay at home. The digital divide, combined with the lack of unified sign language in the country, as well as lack of access to regular education, so they were illiterate, made it impossible for deaf individuals living in rural areas to get life-saving information without the support of their families. In other settings, the fund also saw the opportunity to support some efforts from organizations that already had experience on the topic. One of them was ONG Inclusiva from Chile. Since social distancing was mandatory, they decided to produce a series of animated videos and a handbook where they explain in Spanish what environmental justice is and why persons with disabilities have the responsibility of joining the collective efforts to ensure the right to a healthy environment. They launched these materials through their website and YouTube. And these didactic resources underline the role that we, as persons with disabilities, can play in putting an end to harmful practices such as highly polluting industries. And this kind of information is key to reach persons with disabilities who do not speak English and who need easy to understand materials to incorporate the topic in their agenda. The group is currently finalizing an English version of these materials that will be available for the English-speaking audience as well. Now, in the international arena, there were also many things going on. The launch in April 2020 of the analytical study on the promotion and protection of the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of climate change, that was a report issued by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, marked the beginning of an increased interest in the topic at the international level. For the first time, there was information available in easy-to-understand language that could be used to reflect on how the priority areas for each organization of persons with disabilities were related to climate change. Although it was only available in English, this summary of the more elaborated analysis was key to help the organizations to better understand how their rights were threatened in the context of climate change and environmental degradation, and why it was crucial to take action, together with organizations that were not disability rights focused, but that were quite open to promote an inclusive and intersectional approach to their own activities. In the academic field, Professor Sebastian Jodoin, who has been doing research on human rights and climate change for more than 15 years, kindly invited me in 2020 to become a co-founder of the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program with the Faculty of Law at McGill University. There, the team had the opportunity to meet new people, and we created an advisory committee that brings together the efforts of scholars, activists, and climate action promoters. And in the middle of the pandemic, we launched a website. We also organized and participated in several webinars, and the topic became more and more relevant as we expanded our networks to bring together academic institutions, OPDs, human rights defenders, and donors. In this period, for example, Human Rights Watch did important research on the effects of heat waves in British Columbia during the catastrophic events of 2021. In the same year, and as per request of the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, the CARP collaborated with a number of stakeholders to carry out the North American consultation on youth and climate action. And we successfully advocated for the inclusion of disability in the final Phoenix Manifesto, where eco-anxiety was identified as a specific psychosocial disability that resulted from extreme uncertainty, material loss, and a general sense of hopelessness regarding their future as young people. Um, Meanwhile, the International Labour Organization, which published in 2019 a key document that is Persons with Disabilities in a Just Transition to a Low Carbon Economy, also became a pioneer and a powerful ally in the quest of producing knowledge to build solid advocacy strategies for inclusion in the context of building a better future for everyone. Presently, there is a good amount of peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, blogs, webinars, and other materials. However, there are still some gaps that need to be urgently addressed. The first is data collection, which is critical in the context of emergency preparedness and response. It is not clear at this point if persons with disabilities are being consulted in the design of mitigation strategies and to what extent they are affected by the degradation of the environment. This exercise must also include qualitative research to gather evidence that can be used in advocacy activities at every level. A concrete example that we have found is the famine that is actually experiencing southern Madagascar, where CBM and the Global Green Grants Fund have been teaming up with the Plateforme de Fédération des Personnes Handicapées de Madagascar to determine concrete social arrangements that can prevent persons with disabilities from having access to relief efforts. What are the obstacles for effectively reaching families with a disabled members, and what are the challenges that they face, such as forced relocation or impossibility to receive humanitarian aid. We have found several concrete social arrangements around age and gender, as well as a distribution system that exclude those who don't have a birth certificate, which is a common situation for persons with disabilities in rural areas worldwide. Moving forward, it is important to share our experience and our knowledge with environmental justice and climate action promoters. They are willing to learn, and we as academics, as advocates, and as members of the disability community, we must also learn from their experience to constantly refresh our ideas and strengthen our position as a new and vibrant member of the movement against environmental degradation. Probably the most committed ally that I can identify at this point is the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, led by an organization called CIEL. Over the past 2 years, the disability has become a priority instead of being an afterthought in their agenda. Lastly, it is important to mention that several organizations of persons with disabilities all over the world are working towards the creation of a disability caucus at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in a context where disability is an emerging topic, in a dialogue that started back in 1994. No doubt, an inclusive conversation on climate change is long overdue. So just to conclude, I want to leave this idea for you. We cannot afford to work alone on this. And I trust that this exciting opportunity provided by the Disability Summer School at Galway University will translate into new points of departure for developing knowledge that will constantly refresh our discourse in the quest to address human rights in this pivotal moment. when everyone must urgently address environmental degradation and climate change from a human rights perspective. Thank you very much. I am available for questions.
So Yolanda, excuse me, is available for as part of the Q&A afterwards. So I think that was very interesting discussion on particularly on the climate area of disability, and brought to me the importance of intersectionality here, that this is a classic case of the intersection of various rights in this context. Three things I took from that before we pass to the next speaker. One is this sense that people with disabilities should be agents of change, not just subject to change. And I think that sense of engagement, particularly important. It's always good, when I was an academic, still try to do a little bit, but not as much as I would like, always good to get topics, as Yolanda gave at the end, for research. So that sense of data, that qualitative research that needs to be done, I think particularly important here. And then thirdly, that sense of internationalization, which we have here in any event. But I think Yolanda brought that very nicely. Which brings us to our next speaker, who's Rama Mustafa, who's an advocate and independent consultant with expertise in disability rights and inclusion at global level. She's a Master's of Law degree from this university, National University of Ireland, Galway, and an MBA from the University of Khartoum in Sudan. My background is business, and I always felt a very powerful intersection was people with different experiences coming to do an MBA. Like Rama has done. So I'd like to welcome her here, and I think in particular her perspective on this area will be very important to us. So I leave the floor again to Rama, and this will bring us up to coffee break or so. We might have some time for questions after this, but coffee around 11:15 or so, and then we'll have the third speaker after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ahmed Mustafa. I'm going to talk about the challenges faced persons with disabilities in the economic context. I will start with by reminding you the statistics on disability. As you know, the World Health Organization made that 15% of the world population are with disability. Was estimated that 10.2 million persons with disabilities are displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations. Persons with disabilities are among the most marginalized and many badly affected communities. The lack of integrated data as well as the video presentations already mentioned, and the resistance and the exclusion of persons with disabilities from the humanitarian response, further exacerbated the situation of people with disabilities, contributing to the violation of their rights. So that persons with disabilities and their families are disproportionately affected by conflict, and they face many viruses that persons humanitarian assistance. Also, they face particular avoidation risks. They demand certain legal rights and also excluded from the decision-making process. So I'm going to talk in more details about this challenges, and I also would like to share with you the findings of our recent research on the situation of individuals with disabilities in influence with outcome. This research commissioned by the Islamic Relief in collaboration with the International Disability Alliance, and it will give you all we have to document the lived experience of individuals with disabilities in Sudan. First, I would like to start with what we found with regard to the institutional barriers that face persons with disabilities So, very organizations that interview reported that sector standards, guidelines, and policies consider the requirements of persons with disability. However, the meaningful financial and other technical support are still needed to make these commitments reality. And also the report shows that the national legal framework require more legal reform in order to adequately address the inclusion of persons with disability in situation of risk and situation of conflict. Yeah, the Disability Act and other related acts does not provide for the protection of disability-based discrimination, and they do not consider the denial of freedom of accommodation and disability-based discrimination. So this is one of the main challenges that face refugees with disability now, unfortunately, less people in the many areas in the world, not only in Sudan. Also the other barriers, are the attitudinal barriers, the stigma and discrimination that faces refugees with disability, the negative attitudes, and especially for those with psychosocial and intellectual disability who face more discrimination. And according to the persons with disability volunteer group, that assistance program mostly focus on those with physical and mental disability, and they do not consider what we call down the related groups of persons with disability, persons hearing disability, intellectual, psychosocial, and lifelong persons. Also, the other issue that we consider the most important challenge is the intersectionality. And you know, disabilities are not a homogeneous group. They face multiple and compounding forms of discrimination, including on the basis of disability and other intersecting identity factors that may lead to future of exclusion. For example, if you take women and girls, they face additional challenges, including a lack of accessible and reliable information and access to the essential needs such as safe and accessible tools, shelter and wash, the access to sexual and reproductive health. Refugees are intended displaced women and adults with disabilities are exposed or increased for possible forms of gender-based violence, including violence and abuse by intimate partners, family members, and caregivers. Our research also shows that refugees with disabilities who they are bringing and then age girls with disabilities who are denied participation in physical activities for refugees on the basis of gender or because they lack male companion permission. Also, they are exposed for an early marriage. Yeah. Also, they are exposed to both and early marriage experience, also sterilization and sexual violence. Women and girls with disability may be uniquely vulnerable to human trafficking during the conflict. So this is the effect of the intersectionality between disability and other factors. Also, where next slide, we have found the barriers with regard to identification and registration. Refugees with disabilities are not identified in the registration process. Those with less visible disability are likely to be overlooked. Children with disability may not be set at birth. Identification process follow a medical model approach. gender, refugees with disabilities. Even when registering them, they have been asked whether someone has a disability with a yes or no response option, or identifying persons with disabilities based on visual cues. And they do not ask about their lived experience and their support needs. So and that is why we found the issue of insufficient data and statistical relations with disability system. Barriers around access to information also is another thing that takes persons with disability in context of conflict, inaccessible information and communication systems that do not well-informed persons with disabilities about the available services, or they do not know who and where to ask for assistance. They do not have information on protection-related issues such as compliance mechanisms. Some refugees did not know about the education services available in the town. And also they do not know about their legal rights or the procedures that might be accessible to them. And especially for refugees with hearing disabilities, like social disability and intellectual disability.
Just need to check
Sorry.
contact stuff just so.
Would you mind removing your mask? People are very hard to hear it online. If that's on. And could you hold the mic closer to your mouth? That helps. Yeah.
Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm talking about the barriers around accessing information. And I mentioned that the inaccessibility of information and communication system on the availability of services or during the provision of services is one of the main challenges that face refugees with disability in Eastern Sudan Council. And I think this is a strong challenge where persons with disabilities are not well informed about the available services, they do not know about their legal rights, and especially for those with hearing disabilities and social or intellectual disabilities. And particularly for those facing language barriers in foreign countries, communication can be the biggest challenge to receiving the needed support services. Some are not always equipped to provide information in accessible format such as sign language, braille materials, and easy-to-read formats. Also, interpreters are not always available. Other challenges is access to shelter, overcrowding and conditions in towns are less concerned. This contributes to the protection risk, including gender-based violence and exposure to exploitation. Physical inaccessibility to shelter, and also the long distance from essential services and facilities such as water sources, latrines, health centers, and food distribution points. They also raise the concern about the tents, which are very hot during the day and night, and the lack of electric lighting in the refugee camps and settlement areas to support protection, activity, and safety of refugees with disabilities. Another challenge is access to wash. Also, there is lack of accessibility to safe drinking water, inaccessibility and distance of latrines with the settlement. Latrines have no handles, robes, or chairs that will enable persons with disability to use them without assistance. There is no facility allocated for persons with disabilities. The camp was not there to become accessible for those who use wheelchairs or any other assistive devices. And it becomes muddy during the autumn making also some difficult for them. Another challenge is access to food. They raise the concern about the insufficient food issues, the lack of variety of food, and lack of consideration of individual needs for special food, in particular for children and other persons with disabilities who have health issues, and the long distance to food distribution points with long queues and food distribution points were far from tents and they had to line up for a long time to receive their food, and they do not allow any personal assistant or relative member to bring them their food. They ask them to come by themselves to receive their food. Cash assistance also one of the challenges faced with disabilities on the couch. The lack of information on cash registration processes and delivery mechanisms. Many of the people with disabilities didn't receive the cash support, and the cash provided is not enough to cover their basic needs. And access to the health, they face accessibility of health facilities, the lack of specialized doctors and medicine also are not available. They have to go to hospital and they face the challenge of inaccessible and unaffordable transportation to health care centers. There is no rehabilitation service nor assistive devices. Also, one of the challenges that they face is the inaccessibility of education. So this also this slide is missing. The inaccessibility of the schools, the lack of parent teachers that make the quality of teaching and ability to accommodate people with hearing and intellectual disabilities very limited. No sign language or bilingual education. Also, they raise the issue of high rate of dropouts among children with disabilities. And then the disparity. Qualification and training, also one of the challenges that they reported. Lack of information about the qualification reporting system and the responsible organization. Girls are women with disabilities, so not feeling safe due to romance of gender-based violence incidents. The needs of hygiene kits to mitigate exposure to COVID-19. No specific mechanisms in place to target this disease with disabilities. The last challenge that they reported is exclusion from participation in decision-making and leadership of communities where refugees with disabilities, although they present a significant portion of affected population in refugee camps, they have not been included in the elected committees or participated in their selection. One of the refugees with disability interviews mentioned that we are only classified as merely recipients of aid, and this excludes us from participation and coordination of service provision. The other issue is the attitude and barriers. They also reported that supervisors and managers of the camp hold negative attitudes towards persons with disability when they try to raise their concerns and voice out their needs. They face ignorance and neglect, and sometimes they were not willing to hear them. Having all these challenges, I would like to share with you some recommendations for different stakeholders on how we can ensure the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the humanitarian response. First, population through humanitarian actions. To urgently provide accessible informative materials and accessible channels of communication, and to provide assistive devices and rehabilitation services, and to provide financial support in the form of cash transfers, to provide a diversity of food, especially for persons with disability with high support needs. They need to establish an inclusive education and recognition system, and here we will the use of Washington group set of questions, review of different policies and tools in line with the interagency standing committee on guidelines on disability inclusion, and to ensure the meaningful participation of persons with disability at all levels. And here I would say the participation of persons with disability at every stage, and the previous speakers already mentioned, this will ensure the full inclusion and meaningful participation of persons with disability. Also to enhance the trustful relationship between the disease and humanitarian staff, identify and monitor barriers and enablers to their inclusion, ensure accessibility measures to counter infection, service and information, promote inclusion, empowerment, leadership and management, implement the strategies to reduce disability related stigma, and also to review the recommendation for the government. They have to review and reform their legal frameworks to ensure the full protection and enjoyment of human rights for persons with disability, especially for those in areas affected by conflict, and to improve the level of coordination between humanitarian actors, address the needs of persons with disability as a part of the emergency, and to where all service providers will be making ways of defining the principle to ensure the accessibility for persons with disability, build the capacity of OBDs to work on the emergency response. Yes, because persons with disability is a lot of awareness about how to contribute to the decision-making process and how to ensure their inclusion and participation. This is all one of the obligations of the government and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Recommendations to the United Nations to raise awareness among UN and other humanitarian organizations about international framework and service available for persons with disabilities, and to develop partnership with organizations of persons with disabilities and other organizations working with humanitarian action. Recommendations to organizations of persons with disabilities themselves. Inclusion of disabled persons with inclusion of persons with displaced persons with disabilities in advocacy plans, and to invite displaced persons and refugees with disabilities to coordinate with humanitarian stakeholders and share information. So they need to reach out to displaced persons with disabilities and disabilities, because one of our findings is that there is isolation of individuals with disabilities, and there is always a lack of collaboration between the national OBGs and the persons with disabilities, to establish partnership with humanitarian actors to support their inclusion, support mobilizing disabled persons with disabilities, and contribute to building the capacity of humanitarian actors and government officials. And the last recommendation is to raise public awareness about the rights and interests of persons with disabilities. These are the main challenges faced persons with disabilities in context of conflict and areas affected by the war, And I think during the week we will talk more about more details so we can better understand how to overcome these challenges. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rama. That's very, and I think particularly relevant for the overall topic of the first session, lessons to be learned. So some really good recommendations for a wide range of actors. So thank you very much. I think we go for coffee now, and then we can have one other speaker after the break, who is Teresa Degener, who is at the University of Applied Sciences in Bochum, who will be joining us online. And then we'll have the opportunity for Q&A with Yolanda, which you mentioned earlier, with Rama, and with Teresa as well. So back here, if that's okay, for 11:30. So 11:30. Tea is always and coffee, great time to have conversations, questions as well, maybe to Rama. But enjoy tea, coffee, back here for 11:30. And in the meantime, thank you very much again to Rama for a very comprehensive lessons learned from conflict and crisis. Thank you very much.
Address the issues of conflict, crisis, and climate change, and how they relate to the rights of disabled persons. So my topic will be on health and what are the biggest lessons for disability inclusive responses to ongoing crisis. And I want to focus on three subjects in this regard. I would like to first talk about the legal framework regarding health crisis. As the basis for this legal framework, I take the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. There are, of course, many more laws to be taken into account, but I think the CRPD is the most important when it comes to this subject. Then I will secondly talk about experiences of disabled persons during COVID-19 pandemic. And thirdly, I would like to reflect on the lessons learned, and the resources and materials I will base my short intervention on a working paper on best practices to maintain state obligations under the UN's CRPD during public health crisis, which was published in a research project which I'm proud to be on the advisory board on. The RESPONSE project stands for respecting, the abbreviation RESPONSE means respecting people with disabilities needs and rights in crisis and emergency. And it is undertaken by CDLP Galway. And this research project looks at 7 countries: Ireland, UK, Spain, France, Germany, Sweden, and Italy, and how disabled people experience COVID-19 pandemic. And the working paper is much longer than I can, has a lot of findings, many more findings than I can talk about today, but I put in my presentation the link to that working paper and you can look it up. And the other material I will base my talk on is materials you'll find on a website of a research institute I'm directing at my own university in Bochum, Bodies. That's the Bochum Center for Disability Studies. And we have a certain page there on COVID-19 and especially triage. I'll come back to explaining that word later, but Bodies was involved in, is involved in Germany in a public debate and a court case concerning medical guidelines in times of triage, that is situation of shortage of medical treatment in times of a pandemic or conflict. Coming to my first subject, the legal framework when we look at the CRPD. Of course, Article 11, which has been mentioned in this summer school already, is the starting point. In that article, state parties are demanded by the treaty they have ratified to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities. And then that needs to be on a basis equal to others, and that's why Article 5 and 6, I would say, are the next important article to be cited in this regard. They talk about equality and non-discrimination, and Article 6, especially with respect to women with disabilities. And Article 5 demands that state parties prohibit all discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantee to persons with disabilities equal and effective legal protection against discrimination on all grounds. And Article 6 asks state parties to recognize that women and girls with disabilities are subject to multiple discrimination and take appropriate action against that. The next article, of course, I want to cite are Article 25 and Article 10. They relate to the right to health and the right to life. Article 25 demands from state parties to provide persons with disabilities with the same range, quality, and standards of healthcare, and like they provide to the general public, but also to provide health services needed by persons with disabilities specifically. And in times of pandemic, health pandemics, state parties are obliged to prevent discriminatory denial of healthcare, health services, or food and fluids on the basis of disability. And Article 10 states that every human being has the inherent right to life and should take all necessary measures to ensure its effective and with others. Also important in this regard is Article 31 on statistics and data collection, which asked state parties to collect appropriate information, including statistical and research data, to enable them to formulate and implement policies to give effect to the present convention. This is something we have learned in several crises now, that while there is some statistics and data available for on the general population, the mainstream population, data and statistic on disabled people and in the various life circumstances is completely missing, and that also disables the policymakers to take appropriate action. Of course, many other provisions of the CRPD, of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, are of importance with relation to the topic I'm talking about. I need to mention Article 9, accessibility of all information, accessibility of all places, and accessibility of all services. Article 12 is very important, the right to legal capacity. Every disabled person has the right to make his or her own choices, and if necessary, needs to have supported decision making in this regard. Article 19 talks about the right to independent living. Disabled people should not live in institutions or segregated settings. And of course, Article 24 and 27 need to be mentioned in this regard: the right to inclusive education and the right to inclusive employment. What is also important is to remind ourselves that the legal framework of the CRPD is based on the human rights model and not on the medical model of disability, which means that disabled people cannot be deprived of their human rights based on their impairments. Disabled people should not live in institutions or segregated settings. Being disabled is not a tragic fate. It depends upon the physical, communicative, or attitudinal social circumstances we find ourselves in. And disabled persons are part of human diversity and humanity. So I come to my second point. What are some of the experiences of disabled persons during Corona pandemic? I want to mention a few aspects here. One is the mortality rate. We found that many more disabled people died compared to the general population. However, we miss in most countries good data on it, but we have some good data in some countries. For instance, in the UK, in England, it was found that almost 60% of all deaths in the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic were persons with disabilities. And then we also find in the UK data indicating that people with learning disabilities had a 6 times higher death rate in that time. And these higher mortality rates, which are really shocking, do not only relate to institutional or congregated settings. In fact, there was an increase of 96% of deaths of disabled people receiving home care. Also, this number comes from the UK, where we have found that there is partly is one of the countries where we have the best data concerning the effects of the Corona pandemic on disabled people. The other issue I want to mention is information provision. There was a global failure to provide accessible information immediately in the first wave of the pandemic, which of course put disabled people at higher risk because they didn't understand how to protect themselves. They didn't know what was going on. Another aspect was masking and social distancing. We all learned that we had to wear masks and that we had to socially distance from each other in order to prevent catching the virus. Many disabled people need to read lips, and there was, in the beginning at least, and I think it can be said for many countries until up to now, no information on how to make transparent masks or where to get transparent masks. And those disabled people who cannot use the mainstream masks were not provided with alternative masks or barrier-free or accessible masks. And then while there were made exemptions from social distancing rules in other areas, for instance, hospitals or places where people needed to work, and this work was considered important for the keeping the system up. These exemptions were not made for people who were PAS users, personal assistance service users. In many countries that came much too late, and people who need personal assistance were often left isolated and without the service they needed. Of course, we also learn in many countries that domestic and institutional violence increased during the pandemic, during the Corona pandemic, and we know from statistics before Corona that disabled women and girls are at a much higher risk regarding violence and institutional violence. However, there is hardly any data and statistics on that available. Then this institutionalization and disability-specific services is another important topic. We are told that our institutions are presented to us as a protection and shelter for disabled people. And the international disability movement advocates and researchers have long proved that this is a lie. And during the Corona pandemic, we learned that institutions became death traps because the mortality rate of disabled people dying in institutions were very extremely high. In Ireland, for instance, we have data available saying that 56% of all corona deaths in nursing homes were disabled people, and in Germany, 3/4 of all deaths happened, all corona-related deaths happened in the homes of the elderly. And while we do not know whether these people were all disabled people, we know that many disabled people are people of higher age. We also learned that community-based disability-specific services were reduced to a much higher extent than other mainstream community services. So disabled people were very much left behind, and taking people out of institutions in order to prevent them to die there, because the risk was so much higher to die in institutions, was often not an option for families, because community-based disabilities specific services were shortened, and no alternative systems were set up during Corona pandemic. And finally, I want to come to the topic of health treatment and the topic of triage. Triage relates to a situation where there are not enough medical resources available to treat everyone. So medical personnel has to make a decision whom to treat and whom not to treat, and denial of treatment, of course, means death. We know that from other studies or pre-corona studies that disabled people have less access to healthcare, and the higher death rates among disabled people is not only related to having an impairment, which might lead to an earlier death, which might be true, but more often, and that's what we know from a 2011 WHO report on disability, World Report on Disability, that most often disabled people die because there is a structural discrimination when it comes to health treatment. Disabled people have less access to health treatment than non-disabled peers. Now, in the situation of triage, these structural discrimination increased, and we know from some countries that disabled people were not even accepted in hospitals or in intensive care units for treatment. And we call that in Germany, for instance, the triage before the triage, but also because the medical association started to publish guidelines on what to do in this difficult situation, which of course is difficult for personnel working in these intensive care units. But these guidelines became not only subtly or indirectly discriminatory, but very directly, saying very directly that in times of emergency, what counts is saving the highest amount of people and the most healthy people, because it makes most sense to put the resource, the scarce medical resource, in saving those who have the best prospect of surviving. And we had a similar medical guidelines drafted by a medical association in Germany, and these guidelines were published in April 2020, and it says the doctors, while they should not discriminate, but this prohibition of discrimination was a lip service, because they said, well, then, yeah, doctors should decide who has the best prospect of in which treatment brings the best success, and that in order to analyze or decide what is the best success, the health, fitness, and comorbidity, so other diseases which disabled people often have, shall be taken into account. In Germany, 9 disabled persons who were definitely affected by these guidelines because they are dependent on respirators, personal assistance service, and other support services, filed a constitutional complaint. And in December 2021, our Federal Constitutional Court of Germany decided that yes, that constitutional complaint has merit. The medical guidelines violate the German constitution, and the German constitution was interpreted with the CRPD in mind. Our organization bodies submitted an amicus brief in which we elaborated on the human rights model of disability, and luckily the Federal Constitutional Court picked up this human rights model of disability and said that's what the legislator now needs to implement. And so now we are in the situation that there will be a German law on triage, but and the question is, of course, will it be a better law? A couple of days ago, the German Draft Triage Act was published, and unfortunately we have to say that it is not much better. It's a little bit better than these guidelines of the Medical Association, in that the triage law, the draft triage law in Germany expressively says that disability-based discrimination is prohibited in making these life treatment decisions, but there is no effective protection. For instance, it is not defined of what is the best success in treatment, and how what kind of procedural safeguards shall be put in place in order to prevent structural discrimination. Also, the prevailing medical model among medical personnel has not been tackled in this draft law, and so I am afraid to say that at the moment it is not an improvement. What are the lessons learned? I think we can say that emergency situations compound and aggravate the structural direct and indirect discriminations of disabled persons in healthcare, which we have already had before Corona or before this emergency situations. And in any further emergency situations, this will continue to happen unless some human rights-based response policy is put in place. What we also learned during Corona is that the human rights model of disability was replaced or overruled by the medical model of disability. That can be seen in this, how disabled people were treated in institutions, that they were less protected there, that people did not understand that institutionalization is a death trap in pandemic situations. It was medical model was seen in the lack of accessible emergency information, but also the triage discussion shows us very clearly that the life of disabled people are clearly valued less than the lives of non-disabled people, and this is a direct, clear discrimination of disabled people, and basically it is utilitarian and eugenic thinking which comes to the surface. So what we need is active participation of DPOs, disabled people's organizations, in legal and policy responses to emergency situations. We can see that clearly whenever local or regional or international disability organizations took action. It had an effect on policymakers. What is needed is more involvement, more participation. We need it with respect to health treatment in emergency situations, a human rights-based triage, vaccination, testing, and data collections. I think these are the most important steps we need to work on. And finally, I would like to mention the Build Back Better principle, which is a principle deriving from international law in relation to the disaster and crisis management. And the Build Back Better principle means after a disaster like an earthquake, we need to make sure that what we build back is better, is human rights orientated. Buildings need to be accessible. We don't need to repeat, we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. And we can see this Build Back Better principle applied even in the corona pandemic when it comes to environmental issues, for instance, and in some way also with respect to accessibility topics. But I think what we need to learn is to apply the Build Back a Better CRPD with Build Back Better principle with the full CRPD, with all the rights enshrined in the CRPD in mind. And I think that, for me, is the biggest lesson learned from Corona. I thank you so much for your attention.